Hello, everyone. Hi, welcome to this session on multilingualism. So my name is Melanie Gréau, and I'm very honored to be the chair of this amazing session today. I'm a speech and language therapist by background, but I'm currently working as a consultant for the disability program of the World Health Organization. So it's always a great opportunity to go back into speech and language therapy world. And multilingualism is a topic that is very close to my heart, and we have an amazing list of speakers today. So it's a real treat to be here. And we have a really packed agenda. We have 3 presentations in less than 1 hour, but I will take just a few seconds of your time to go through some housekeeping points. So first of all, this session doesn't have live Q&A at the end, but we still encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A button in the conference platform. You can do that, and the speakers and myself will be able to have a look at it, and we can answer typing our answers, or we can also, you can contact us independently on the platform later, but we'll try our best to address any queries. The chat function is also there, so please feel free to share any comments, any feedback. We really want to stimulate a lot of engagement on this important topic, so please feel free to use this function. As you do, send your comments and questions and feedback and advice or experience on the topic. Please remember to be respectful and kind. We want this to be a safe space to share all this information. I should also mention that this session is recorded, so you'll all have access to the recordings after the session. So we know it's a packed agenda. If you miss a few points, you'll be able to go back to it. So please enjoy, relax, and you don't have to take notes just yet. You'll be able to go back to all the material later. Also, I should mention that there's a feedback function. So please, at the end of the session, feel free to spend a couple of minutes to let us know how the session went. It's very helpful for the RCSLT as they plan their events, but also for us to know how to do things better for the next time, or to know also what has worked really well that we can reproduce for future events. And finally, there's a secret code that will appear at the end. So please make a note of that, and that will help you to go up the board for the big challenge of the RCSLT conference. So yeah, these are really the main points that I needed to mention before we kick off on this very exciting session. And so we have 3 speakers, as I said earlier. And the first one is Davide Di Prete, who's a PhD student at UCL, and he's gonna tell us about focusing on teaching approaches and critical reflections on multilingualism in phonetics and phonology, and SLT students, teachers, dual perspective study, which sounds
Yes.
really fascinating. So Davide, over to you when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. I'm gonna share the screen.
And again, I'll keep an eye on the Q&A, so please post your comments. We're very enthusiastic about having a discussion with you today. Great, we can see the screen.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
hello everyone. My name is Davide Di Prete, and I'm going to present on our work on multilingualism in phonetics and phonology, an SLT student-teacher dual perspective study. This work was funded by the ERB Center at the Faculty of Brain Science at University College London. Let me introduce the team together with myself, Andrew Nevins from UCL, Juditha Smith, postdoc from Modena, Reggio Emilia and University of East Anglia, and Maria Garraffa from University of East Anglia, who is also attending the conference today, and we will be happy to respond to any questions after the session. And I know Maria is on the platform, so you can ask me or her. So I'll start by introducing the background of the experience of SLT practice in the UK. Greot, Melanie et al. 2024 reports that SLTs who speak more than one language often face unique challenges in the profession. Many feel pressure to speak perfect English, and others are not feeling confident of their training. So we believe that multilingualism should be seen as a strength in the profession. Multilingual SLTs can understand clients' needs in a more personal and culturally sensitive way. And just to compare with the experience of SLT in other countries, from the bulletin last autumn 2023, a fourth-year SLT student at the National University of Malaysia says, the language selected for therapy is chosen based on our observations of parent-child interaction in videos of home play sessions, formal and informal assessment, and a detailed parental report. And then continues saying, the speech sciences program at our institution is designed around multilingual practice. So they're trained in multilingual services, cultural sensitivity, and effective caregiver interaction. And this enables us to make a positive impact on the lives of Malaysian diverse population. So they add, for example, that it's quite common for them to prepare materials for a session in one language while the child responds in another. And to finish, they mentioned that their university program gives training on other languages widely spoken in the community. Additionally, they also have to complete cultural diversity course in the program, and they are taught to be culturally sensitive and to take the cultural differences into account when offering the services. Now, in the Royal College SLT recommendation, multilingualism is present and is highlighted as a separate subject in the guidance, but it is not linked to the teaching of phonetics or speech sounds, including any other linguistic components. So it's a separate box at the end. And currently, the guidance in 2021 on SLT training includes general recommendations for teaching phonetics and phonology, and this allows accredited institutions to shape the teaching in different ways according to the master course or the undergrad, if it's 3 or 4 years. So the aims of our study, the first step, we call it a step 1 of our study, is what we've done is collect data from current SLT students on confidence on knowledge and practice around multilingualism. And regarding the materials, we developed 2 separate online surveys, one for SLT students and one for SLT educators. In the surveys, we had 3 sections, combining quantitative and qualitative questions. Our first section is the demographic information. The second one is the curriculum coverage. So we were asking students and teachers about the perception and confidence on knowledge and practice of multilingualism. And the last section is our critical reflections on multilingualism covered in the curriculum. So the results, our demographic section, we had a total of 50 participants recruited from SLT accredited programs. The inclusion criteria were to attend at least year 2 or that they had done phonetics before, and 40% of participants described themselves as being bilingual. In section 2, the curriculum coverage, we asked the students to rate on a Likert scale the level of confidence on certain topics and certain practices in phonetics and phonology training. And for example, a sentence or a question was, or a statement, I feel prepared to assess and treat clients with non-native English language background based on the phonetics teaching I received. And from the results, we can see that more than half of students do not feel confident in assessing and treating clients with non-native English language background. When asked about opportunities of placement with bilinguals, so we asked them, do you have opportunities of practical experience, clinical placement or simulation with clients who speak a language other than English at home? And 66% answered that they did have a chance to practice with clients who speak a language other than English. But this leaves more than a third of students with no experience of bilingualism during their training. When asked about the confidence on the phonetic inventories of standard English varieties, regional accent and dialects, word Englishes and non-English languages, so we sort of distribute it on a gradient, the confidence gradient worsens as we move away from standard English varieties. This shows that there is still a lot of focus on the standard English variety. We also had opportunities for open questions in the survey. So we asked them, why do you think phonetics training is important as a future SLT, as an open question? And one student said, having a better understanding of the common accent differences can familiarize trainee SLTs with approaching presentation with a different diagnosis mindset. For example, ensuring it's just a region accent variation rather than confirming it's a speech disorder or vice versa. Going back to the confidence this time about practices, we asked to rate the statement, I feel confident using IPA to transcribe standard English varieties and then non-English languages. And from the graphic, we can see a gap between the two. So the gap in the student's ability to transcribe mirrors their confidence in the topic, with a significant difference in transcribing English compared to non-English. And then back to the open questions when we asked them about what are the main challenges in learning non-English phonetic feature, students said, being a multilingual speaker myself, I struggle in learning the phonetic sounds in my first year due to the examples contextualize standard British English. And another student said, we tend to start with English, but I think a flipped learning approach would be better suited to ensuring stronger confidence in multilingual phonetics. We're also interested in finding out whether students had this specific aha moment during training. So we said, was there a specific aha moment during your training or clinical experience when your understanding of multilingualism changed in a meaningful way? And the student said, yes, the realization that an error would occur across languages. Also that the acquisition of more than one language includes code switching as a natural process and not an error. In our final section, so section 3, critical reflections, we investigated languages and identities and the extent to which social, linguistic, and ideological issues were incorporated into phonetics teaching. So in the student survey, we had this list of 5 themes, which we'll see in the next slide, and a total of 17 questions. And so each theme contained different questions. Because of the sensitive topics in multilingualism, we had a prompt that said multilingualism intersects with several sensitive topics, especially in clinical and educational contexts. So rather than ask them to agree or disagree, we asked them to indicate whether the topic has been discussed in the course and how was it raised by the students, by the classmates, or by the teacher, and how was it formally introduced or was it informally mentioned in the class. So our first theme, reflection area 1, was standard versus non-standard varieties. Questions asked about linguistic diversity versus standard varieties. or some accents or dialects that could sound wrong compared to standard English, or perhaps the idea of standard English that can be contentious as it marginalizes regional and non-standard varieties. And we can see different results here, but for the first question, linguistic diversity versus standard variety, was discussed in class and introduced by the teachers. On the teacher survey, at this point in the section 3, we asked teachers to share ideas or activities that allow the teacher to discuss with the student standard versus non-standard varieties in the classroom. And so we have here some, we had an open question with some results. So a teacher said, well, we discussed my own accent, the use of a local vowel chart, clinical videos of local children and adults. And another teacher said, why not asking students to explore their prejudices? Are there accents they dislike? Where does this come from? And do they like their accent? So these are all ideas that can be used to sparkle the discussion. The reflection area 2, language, ideology, and assumptions, we had 3 questions. Terms like accent reduction or modification can carry colonialistic and assimilationist implications, or certain language or language group are associated with lowest standard, or speaking multiple languages confuse children or hinder language acquisition. This was also mentioned in Melanie Greo's paper, whether sometimes the teacher in school that have heard this misconception and the parents just hear and repeat. So we want SLT to be aware that this concept exists and have to be able to deal with the idea, with the concept. Reflection area 3, colonialism and linguistic identity. We talked about language discrimination. We asked them whether this was mentioned in class. Language is deeply tied to culture and personal identity, and this has almost a 50% results that teachers formally include this in the lesson. Power imbalance between dominant and minority language, and whether some languages have historically been imposed due to colonial history. Our 4th reflection area, language policy and integration. We wanted to know about multilingualism as a barrier to communication, and this was formally introduced in the lesson. Also about the politically charged issues of migration and social integration, linguistic policies and histories in different countries, and highly politicized language policies, for example, bilingual education, official language status. And these, of course, can vary according to the countries you are taking your training, but people that are bilingual, they have different cultures, background, and we need to be aware of this concept that exists. And so in this case, multilingualism was mentioned as a barrier to communication and introduced formally. Our last section, reflection area, the last one, 5. We were asking about other communication modalities. For example, code switching, or according to the framework you're using, is also called translanguaging, switching between languages. Also, the sensitivity of that communities in the profession of spoken languages and the prioritization of spoken languages over the sign language, and the marginalization of sign language in speech-focused professions. And these were all discussed and introduced. So this, let's say, concludes our first step, but we have suggestion to continue this work and continue with further steps. We want to integrate multilingualism into the study of linguistics, ensuring that inclusion and diversity are embedded in the foundational training. It has to be at the foundation of SLT's training. Ensuring that all students, and not just going back to our 66%, have opportunities to practice in a multilingual context would be really important. Promoting the debate on social phonetics and social linguistics of multilingualism. and also to continue our work comparing SLT education in the UK with other countries will ensure the long-term impact of our work. And so we're now collecting all our open-ended questions in a qualitative analysis. So thank you, and Maria and I will see you after the session on the platform for questions and any comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Davide. That was fantastic. Really, really interesting presentation, and definitely an area of need. It's quite compelling to see those levels of confidence. And I believe it's the first time that we really have this data showing the real need to train and to have more resources, which is the transition to the next presentation. Also, Davide, there's a couple of very interesting questions that came in the Q&A. So I'll leave you to address that when you have time. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
But moving on then to the next speaker. So it is my absolute honor to introduce Dr. Sean Pert. He doesn't need any introduction. He's very much a big figure in the field of multilingualism in speech language therapy. And today we're going to hear about cultural and linguistic adaptation of expressive language assessments and speech language therapy packages for languages other than English. So more than training, we also need to develop those resources. So yeah, over to you, Sean.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. That's very lovely. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully that's working. So this is work, ongoing work by me and Dr. Carolyn Letts and the wider Lively team who brought the Building Early Sentences Therapy package, which I mentioned in the presentation. So just to remind ourselves that the RCSLT clinical guidelines from 2018 state that SLT should offer home language intervention prior to therapy in the language of education. And that's mainly because we know that L1 supports L2, but not the other way around. And that as well, it has profound effects on the child's ability to interact with their immediate parents, family, and wider community. And that if we provide English only services, because of the frequently encountered differences in language status, which David mentioned in his presentation, children can focus on just English, resulting in a rapid loss of home language. And for that reason, providing advice, assessment and treatment in home language should be a priority as well, to challenge some of the misconceptions of bilingualism that some parents themselves have absorbed from the wider society. I was looking through the guidance, and it's nice to note that RCSLT has always been at the forefront, and that Communicating Quality is a published book which included this advice on home language or mother tongue is 30 years next year, and there was certainly local guidance before then. So as a profession, we've always been at the forefront of promoting a whole language approach, but the barriers to that are often around available tools, packages, and so forth for non-specialists in the area. A couple of years ago, the Healthcare and Professions Council also included in their standards of proficiency the centrality of working in home language, with a specific promise for us to assess and plan interventions in the service user's home language with the assistance of professional interpreters. And this is because as an advisor, I often encounter people who are relying on non-professional interpreters, being pressured because of things like financial costs and so forth. And it's important to note that finance cannot be used as a reason not to meet these standards because of the great harm that can result by not following the standards on both the child, the family, and so on. So what are the advantages of home language? Well, bilingual to bilingual communication will trigger code switching. And code switching is when two languages or more are used in the same utterance. And code switching utterances, so truly bilingual utterances where children are able to draw on their language knowledge from both languages, are their longest and most complex utterances. That means that we're getting a truly representative view of their expressive language when they have access to both. So when children feel confident, comfortable speaking both languages, they're highly likely to code switch with another bilingual speaker, such as an interpreter or a bilingual speech therapist or assistant. That provides us with this holistic picture of the child's language ability. If we assess children, say, in environments where they're used to speaking just English or Welsh in Wales, such as a school environment, then obviously they're pragmatics. They understand that English is expected, those unwritten rules, and they will attempt to just speak in English. And that then limits them and reduces their apparent mean length of utterance. So it's really important to encourage that home language confidence in children. And finally, we should avoid applying monolingual normative data, which is frankly most of the data that's available in published assessments. So that would include things like age equivalence, percentile ranks, those kind of figures, because what you're doing then is comparing the child in front of you with monolingual English children who have only ever learnt English, and that's an unfair comparison. And that's where historically these false claims that bilingual children are not as advanced in their language abilities than monolingual children arises from. So encouraging home language encourages the maintenance of home language within the home and family. This is often influenced by parents' attitudes to integration versus valuing their unique culture. And there's often a tension, and I think most discussions of bilingualism will show that parents and bilingual young people themselves feel this pull. Do they support English for educational success or preserve their culture? The research shows that children who are confident in their home language are better additional language learners. So it's a false choice in the first instance, but parents are often not informed about that information. And they may have received incorrect information to only use English from other professionals who aren't aware of the more recent guidance. So acquiring a home language is a fantastic foundation for additional language learning because children have cracked the code, as it were, of language learning, and they can use that psycholinguistic machinery to acquire English more effectively. So barriers to home language care: there's a dearth of published assessments and therapy packages. Therapists will likely be unfamiliar with the languages they don't share with the family. And even bilingual therapists, although as we heard earlier, they're a boon to the profession, they can still encounter families who they don't share a language with. So here in Manchester, where I work, the last census, there were over 300 languages. And you're unlikely to speak more than 2 or 3 of those languages, even if one is multilingual. And it's not just the language, it's the knowledge of culture and diversity within that community, that if you are a member of that community, as interpreters and bilingual individuals are, then language and culture are inextricable. And one of the things that my retired colleague, Dr. Carol Stowe, always says is that children who have access to home language can receive their culture through the medium of their home language. Without your home language, you're isolated to a great extent from a deep understanding of one's own culture. So many years ago, I devised the bilingual assessment of simple sentences, which is a basic picture description assessment of expressive language. And that was aimed at children who have a Pakistani heritage background, speaking either Mirpuri, which is a widely spoken but low status language from the Azad Kashmir area, Punjabi, and the high status Urdu language, which many people have heard of. This was done in partnership with bilingual assistants, with adult informants from the community, and tried and tested on local children, which was great fun because, as well, they're quite surprised that a white man can speak Mirpuri, which always makes the children giggle because I'm breaking the pragmatic rule that they can look at somebody and judge which language they can speak. So around the structure of that was designed around the translation protocol, which takes a systematic morpheme by morpheme translation, so that when we're transcribing expressive language in clinic or school, we're not just seeing the translation, but we're seeing the original utterances by the children. So BASE has now been adapted into Spanish, Malayalam, and the pictures have been redone to account for those cultural differences. The translation protocol has been put into place to ensure that those languages are mapped correctly. And that work was led by these authors in partnership so that they could, I was basically a critical friend saying, is that a morpheme? Could we split that a bit further? How does that operate? So being an outsider from the community, but bringing my linguistic knowledge was really useful because I had no prior knowledge. Whereas if you speak a language, it's quite, because you automatically understand it, it's sometimes quite difficult to stand back from that and analyze it. So there's lots of advantages to having this partnership of kind of an in-group of people who understand and speak the language and the culture, and an out-group who have linguistic phonetic knowledge. So you can see here the pictures were redrawn, using more of a traditional bism for the brushing verb here in the base. And the Spanish version reflects the cultural activities found in those communities, such as dancing and playing music on the guitar. So it's really important to not stick with and just do a straightforward translation, because children might not recognize the people, the dress, or the activities, and therefore be limited in their expression. So these are adaptations, not translations. I forgot to mention there's a QR code in there. If you want to answer 3 simple questions: do you have access to professional interpreters, and can you offer home language treatment and therapy? That'd be really interesting for us. If you scan that with your camera, that'll take you to that little 3-question quiz. So what we're looking for when we adapt is similar levels of complexity to the original assessment. We started with thematic roles, which we think are more universal. So, for example, if the girl is hopping, no matter which word order you have, so Mirpuri has a subject, object, verb order, the surface structure may differ, but the girl is always the person hopping. They're the doer, and hopping is the verb. And things that are affected, like if you kick a ball, the ball is always the patient. So we can use that thematic role structure and then see what happens when that language is projected onto the surface. It's really interesting when that happens. So a simple sentence like the girl is hopping, which is an intransitive verb in English, you have to do a hop in Mirpuri. So it uses a helper verb. So it's more complex than it would be in a straightforward apparent translation from English. The best building early sentences therapy, which Christina McKean presented at last year's conference, was shown to be effective in developing children's expressive language, and you can download the best approach for free, including our adaptations in home language. These were also based on those thematic roles. So it's crucial that we're not just translating a surface form assessment or treatment. We've got assessments and therapies that are based on universal principles, and then really carefully seeing how the morphology, syntax and grammar pans out on the surface projection. So a big thank you to our language informants here, but we're maintaining the active ingredients, which is providing language models to help the child crack the code, not being afraid to change the materials to meet the cultural needs, so children say as much as possible. The signing of the morphology, because the signing of the frame was really shown to be important, which was a real surprise to a lot of practitioners who think that the content words are most important. Code switching and slips of the tongue show that monolingual and bilingual children project a sentence frame and then fill it in. And so children can draw on their vocabulary from any of their languages. Sure. The challenges are children sometimes don't respond to pictures. And when we contacted publishers, apparently this is true for English assessments, but they just ignore the data. So don't be surprised when children don't respond, particularly young children. Children may respond in just the language of education, and that's because of the pragmatic issue we mentioned earlier. Interpreters may not have experience or training of the role of the speech therapist or be comfortable with working with children. And there's a big need for interpreters to have training in that area. SLTs also need training on how to work effectively with interpreters to make sure that things are delivered in the way that they're envisaged and not altered in any way. And the more experience people have of working with interpreters, the more confident they become. So we know that a little bit like David was saying earlier, we need more training and case studies around working alongside interpreters. I do say working alongside and not using interpreters because they are very valuable members of the team. So in summary, we are able to successfully produce assessments and therapy materials who speak languages other than English by using a systematic translation protocol and centering, very crucially, native speakers at the heart of that to give us the cultural knowledge. So this co-production approach is really vital. And that leads to a better range of available clinical tools, which improves home language outcomes. And one of the key things I want to say is an informal home language assessment is always superior to assessing in English or trying to just straightforward translate a English assessment, which will be inappropriate. So even with culturally and linguistically aligned assessments, there are still challenges ahead. So we've still got lots of work to do. So do look out for our forthcoming papers from the Lively team. And there's some of our next steps in terms of undergraduate training, interpreter training, working alongside interpreters guidance updates, which RCSLT I know are undertaking at the moment, and an expansion of the languages available for those resources. I think I've used every second. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sean. That was fantastic. And I really like how you, the aspect on co-production. I think it's so valuable and it's great to see this happening on the ground. And also how you're talking about adaptations and with the cultural needs considered fully throughout that process and not just the linguistic considerations. So very rich data set and very rich resources that are being produced. That's really good. So we're running a little bit behind schedule, so we'll very swiftly move on to the next presentation. But Sean, there's a lot of it's been buzzing on the Q&A, so there's a lot of questions for you waiting when you have a moment to go to the Q&A section of the platform. Our next speaker is Lauren Newman. She's a speech language therapist from Barts Health NHS Trust. Unfortunately, she couldn't be with us today, but she recorded a video for her presentation titled Speech and Language Therapy Outcomes for Deaf Children and Young People from Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Families. So we are going to play the recording as soon as we're ready.
My name's Lauren Newman and I'm a speech and language therapist from Barts Health NHS Trust. I'm here to talk to you today about my project that I ran in East London on speech therapy outcomes for deaf children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. This project was funded by the NIHR, and my supervisors were Dr. Fiona Kyle and Professor Ros Herman. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person today. I'm actually on maternity leave, but I'd really love to hear from you with any questions or feedback you have about this project. So yeah, please do contact me if you're interested. So just to set the context for my project a little bit. So yeah, my project was run in Tower Hamlets, which is a borough in East London. Tower Hamlets has a really high number of deaf children. We have around 460 with a permanent deafness, and that's kind of similar numbers to much larger geographical areas such as Manchester and Cambridgeshire. We also have really high level of cultural and linguistic diversity, so yeah, and much higher levels in the rest of the UK. So for example, 77% of the population of Tower Hamlets belong to an ethnic minority group, compared to just 18% of the population across the UK. And we also have a really high number of residents who don't speak English as their main language, and we have the highest level of child poverty in the UK. So I'm currently on a clinical academic pathway. I'm really hoping to go on to do both clinical work and research as part of my career in the future. So today this is kind of I'm just talking about the research that I've done as the first step towards that. So this is my dissertation project that I did for my research masters, and I kind of chose this topic because I feel like there's very little research on this area, on speech therapy for deaf children from diverse families in the UK, and you know, considering the type of children that I work with in Tower Hamlets, I thought this was a really important area to focus on. So yeah, my research looks at the outcomes for deaf children from culturally and linguistically diverse families in Tower Hamlets. And my research questions were to look at what the demographic characteristics were for this group of children, what the outcomes were, the language and the functional outcomes were for this group, and whether commonly studied research variables could influence or predict the outcomes for this group in the same way that they do in the literature for deaf children kind of internationally. So these were the 10 predictors that we looked at. Again, we pulled these from existing studies on language outcomes for deaf children. And we split them into these 3 categories: auditory, environmental and child related, just because that's often what happens in the literature as well. So yeah, you can see the 10 variables that we looked at here. The method we used was basically a retrospective case note audit, a caseload evaluation. We used our electronic record system and pulled off lots and lots of data from there to try and answer our research questions. And so we started off with pulling off a list of children that were on the speech therapy caseload, or that had recently been on the speech therapy caseload, and that gave us a list of 103 children to look at, which was quite a nice sample size. We looked at children aged 0 to 16, but we are aware that because our service criteria is different for these children, depending on whether they're in the 0 to 5 age group or they're in the school age group, that might have a bit of an impact on the results, because the children we see at school age are generally those who have more of a severe or profound level of deafness, or that have implants, or that use BSL, that go to a specialist deaf support base, whereas the younger children we work with have kind of all different levels and types of deafness. So yeah, so for a lot of the analysis, we split it by age group so we can see these patterns a bit more clearly. And the data that we collected was in 2 stages. The first stage was basically, yeah, all of this demographic information, kind of key demographics about the children, the languages that they used and the context that they used them in, and also the language use of their parents as well and families. We looked at their deafness-specific information, you know, cause of deafness, level of deafness, onset of deafness, that sort of thing. We looked at factors that relate to parent engagement, such as parent attitudes to deafness, parent well-being, how well parents attend appointments, those sorts of things. And then any other bits that we thought might be useful to collect, like whether the children have any safeguarding issues, whether the children were born outside of the UK, that sort of thing. And then our second stage was pulling off the outcome data. So we looked at both therapy, speech and language therapy assessment scores as our first measure, either in English or BSL. So we looked at any data that was collected within a kind of 12, 13-month window, and we converted all of these scores onto a deafness outcome scale, which we adapted from another research project. And this was to try and make the data a bit more kind of consistent and comparable, because there were lots of different assessments used for different children in different ways. So yeah, we tried to standardize this a little bit. And then our second measure was using TOMS scores, therapy outcome measures scores. So we used the adapted scale for deafness. And again, we used 3 of the scales from that activity, which we used as our measure of functional language, and then participation and well-being we also collected data on as well. And so this is, yeah, kind of an overview of our results. I won't go through each stat, but I think it's just nice to see that there is a really high level of diversity in our sample. You know, 97% are from ethnic minority backgrounds. Nearly half of the children are living in the most deprived 20% of postcodes in the UK. We've got 95% exposed to a language other than English at home. Over a third require an interpreter. Parents require an interpreter for appointments. And yeah, we've got most children using English as their main form of communication, but actually nearly half of our children are accessing BSL at some point between 0 and 2, which is really positive to see. And yeah, you can see just the split over the 3 age groups there. It's fairly even. Looking at deafness-specific information, again, some of this differed depending on the age of the child because of our differing service criteria. But I think the interesting areas to look at here was that we had over a third of children with a progressive deafness, over half of children that had an additional need or a comorbidity for their deafness, and over a third with a deaf family member. And I think all of these things have implications for the kind of support that we provide for children and what their support looks like. Yeah, and we can also see that the majority of children are receiving their current hearing devices over 12 months old, which is something else to consider. Again, this is our kind of parent engagement data. You can see that over half of parents have attended a BSL class at some point, which is really great. We've got over a third of parents that have an identified wellbeing difficulty. Some of our other data around safeguarding, where the children were born, and parent attitudes is all in there as well. If we move on to our second research question, where we look at the speech and language therapy outcomes. So for the first measure that we talked about, which is actually the SLT assessment data, we found that 75% of the children on the sample had completed an expressive language assessment, and 80% of the sample therefore presented with an expressive language difficulty. And you can see that kind of how that's broken down over the 6 groupings. So these 6 kind of scores are based on the deafness outcome scale that I talked about earlier. So you can see for the whole sample where they kind of came out overall, mostly was severe. But actually these charts at the bottom, and the same for the next couple of slides, is when we split it by age group, so we could see that in a bit more detail. And again, it includes the fact that our criteria is a bit different for the children that we see across ages. So you can see here that actually in early years, the majority of children are coming out as profound. There's a bit more of an even split across primary, but across primary and secondary, the highest bar is severe difficulties in expressive language. Similarly for receptive language, so yeah, 81% of the sample had completed a receptive language assessment in the time frame, and 71% presented with receptive language difficulties. And you can see here a bit more of an even split across the 6 scores for the sample as a whole. And yeah, a fairly even split across primary and secondary, but you're still seeing this really high bar for profound difficulties in the early group. And so what we wanted to do is look at the differences between receptive and expressive language scores in a bit more detail. So we ran some follow-up analyses and found that actually there was a significant difference between the groups, which suggests that the children were presenting with more significant expressive difficulties than they were receptive difficulties, which kind of ties into existing research about deaf children's language, that generally they tend to have better receptive language than expressive language. And then looking at the TOMS scores, we kind of analysed these in a very similar way. So you can see the spread of scores across the sample as a whole, and then broken down by age group. So 88% of the children had completed, had got completed TOMS scores for the 3 measures, which is really great. And again, we saw differences just from looking at these bar charts between the age groups. So we ran follow-up analyses to look at whether these differences were significant across age groups, and it came out that they were. So I think it kind of suggests that functional outcomes improve as the age group kind of increased in age. And I think it just illustrates that the functional skills that are assessed by the TOMS scales, such as making comments and asking questions, whether they can repair communication breakdowns, make decisions, whether they can kind of self-regulate and have a positive self-image, were kind of significant and persistent challenges for the deaf children in this study. As even in the secondary age group, the majority of children didn't reach age-appropriate functional outcomes in these really key areas. Yeah, and these were just the other scales which showed fairly similar patterns. So these were the scores for participation, so the child's participation in their environment. And these were scores for the children's levels of well-being. And our final research question then was looking at variables that influence the outcomes. So again, we had these 3 measures here that were our outcome variables. We plotted these against our 10 predictor variables that I explained earlier. And so we used a combination of kind of correlation analysis, Mann-Whitney tests, Creutz-Wallace tests, to look at in isolation whether these different predictor variables were associated with these outcome variables. And these were the ones that we found to be significant, these ones in green, or approaching significance, which was this orange one here. So there were 5 variables overall that came out as having a significant association with at least one of the outcome variables. And so then what we did for the second stage of the analysis was take these 5 significant variables and put these into a multiple ordinal logistical regression model to look at what these factors do when they're combined with one another. You're not just looking at them in isolation. And this is what we found. So actually, when combined together in one model, the independence with amplification variable is coming out as significant across all 3 measures. The additional needs variable is coming out across 1, potentially 2 measures, but these other 3 are not coming out as significant. So it shows these 2 are having a much larger impact than these 3. So yeah, thinking about what these results show, we see that there's a higher level of diversity in our sample compared to even just the rest of Tower Hamlets, but also compared to the rest of deaf children across the UK as well. We also see that the outcomes for these children are really variable depending on age and whether it's receptive language or expressive language, but we do see a significant difference between expressive and receptive scores. And yeah, the kind of looking at how they change over time shows that we really do need to keep focused on the intervention that we provide in the early years for deaf children in our sample. And the variables that influence outcomes, so yeah, these were the 5 that came out as significant predictors in at least one area of language. So the presence of additional needs, independence with amplification, SES, access to BSL, and progressive deafness. But actually, when we plug these into the regression model, it's just these 2 that have the most impact. But I think it still shows that we can focus on these areas. You know, these are the really important areas to focus on when we're supporting families, things like early access to BSL, education around deafness and additional needs, and education around progressive deafness, and support with consistent and independent device use. And yeah, just to say thank you so much for listening. I'm hoping to go on to do a PhD to look at these things in more detail in the future. If you'd like to keep in touch with any of the updates and things that are going on, please do follow me on social media or feel free to email me. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Lauren. We missed not having you live with us today, but we really appreciated your video and you sharing some of your fascinating research. So unfortunately, we are running out of time. Thank you for staying with us a few more minutes. I really want to thank now all the 3 presenters for their fantastic presentations. It's absolutely fantastic to see the breadth of the research on multilingualism in speech and language therapy. And we really need more of that because those populations are often very much left behind. I also want to thank all the attendees for the fantastic questions that you've put in the Q&A. There are a lot of them, so we'll try our best to answer them when this session is closed. And yes, I think we can wrap up here. Thank you all so much. I wish you a very good rest of the conference.